Hi, my name is Corey Reeser, and I am doing this week's critical pedagogue assignment on Carter G. Woodsen, who was born December 19th, 1875, and passed away April 3rd, 1950. Carter G. Woodsen was an African American historian and educator who is predominantly known for advocating for the education of African American students during the early portions of the 20th century. He argued that the exclusion of African Americans in the story of America as a whole was categorically wrong. So he sought and promoted for the major contributor to basically include the major contributions that African Americans made into the overall story of American history. The hurdles that Carter G. Woodson faced in this area were not small, and they were actually pretty monolithic. He not only had to develop and convince a Caucasian governing body that their methods of education were inadequate, he also had to do it under the backdrop of prevalent and accepted racism when Jim Crow laws were in full effect. So some of the major works of Carter G. Woodson. The first was entitled The Miseducation of the American Negro, which establishes this thesis upon which he builds his entire philosophy of the indoctrination and forced assimilation of African Americans in the American education system. These theories are extremely important to understand as a social studies educator because many of the elements that Woodson advocates to reform are still being implemented in certain portions of the country and in certain curriculums in certain states. So it's important to incorporate the tenets that he advocates for, so basically the inclusion within historical perspective, in order to provide the most accurate information possible and in a way that's reflective of the cultural experience of the student body that you have. So one example of this would be, don't just give the historical perspective so for world history, don't give the historical perspective that European explorers were just simply brave adventurers, because they were also genocidal psychopaths with little regard for human life. That's the part of the story that we often don't get. The same goes for African American history. We oftentimes hear about, all of the wonders of the founding fathers, but we don't hear about the contributions that African Americans made in the shadows of American society, really all the way through the 1960s and 70s until they were officially recognized for them. So Carter G. Woodson's legacy is actually pretty predominant. Carter he carried out long after his death in 1950. He was the original founder of Black History Week, which eventually became as what we now know Black History Month. And this basically the goal of this was to bring awareness of the contributions that African Americans made to American society, because he felt that these things were largely ignored by the Anglo-American approach. And it's also important to consider that the legacy of Carter G. Woodson extends far beyond the celebration, because he authored over 20 scholarly pieces of work, the miseducation of the Negro being one of them that I identified previously. And he also established, we can go back, the Journal of the Negro History, which basically was meant to catalog all of the historical contributions and major historical events of the African American community. So when you look at Woodson's theory in the classroom, the philosophy of Carter G. Woodson can and should be applied directly into a social studies classroom for a variety of reasons. It's important to always reflect on historical perspectives that are being conveyed to a classroom of students, because the historical perspective that's being conveyed in the text or in the content material may not necessarily add up to the student's interpretation of a historical or political event. So, with my own ethnic lineage, I'm Scandinavian, so my interpretation of historical events through my upbringing was largely based on the accepted indoctrination of European or Anglo history. It was not until I took a Minorities in America class as an undergrad that my regard for the European perspective of history basically was fundamentally demolished because one, it was wrong, and two, it provided a very skewed version of historical development and historical understanding. And what Woodsen was advocating for was basically to include the contributions of African Americans into the educational system. And these theories can be transferred to any minority group. So, take Native Americans, for example. Most people do not know that our founding fathers basically borrowed their ideas of federalism and the structure of our government from the Iroquois Indian Nation, because the Iroquois Indian Nation was actually operating under that very system of government at the time. We like to think that the founding fathers received all of their political philosophies and political applications from Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, but the reality was our founding fathers actually got the idea or the philosophy of federalism based off of how the Iroquois nation operated, which was a system of states that, so if you consider the United States, we have 50 states that are represented under the United States. The Iroquois nation operated under that same structure. And being that federalism was never tried before in Europe, and America was the first to implement this, and the Iroquois nation had already developed this process, it would be probably historically correct to give the idea of federalism, which is the American political structure, to the Iroquois nation. So this is an example of Woodsen's historical perspective. You have to include things that tell the overall history and not just one very narrow and skewed view of just the whole field of social studies in general.